This video captures the incredible journey of this family as they experience the transformative power of generosity and kindness. From surprise gifts to unexpected opportunities, the millionaire's actions not only provided immediate relief, but also paved the way for a brighter future. This story serves as a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples of positive change in the world.
Jonathan Blake was driving his luxury car through the bustling streets of New York City. Inside the vehicle, the silence was interrupted only by the soft sound of classical music, something he believed helped keep his mind focused. For Jonathan, every minute was an opportunity to think about how to multiply his wealth or consolidate his position among the big names on Wall Street. However, that day, something out of the ordinary was about to shatter his impeccably planned routine. He stopped at a busy intersection, surrounded by a sea of hurried cars and pedestrians defying the traffic. Jonathan was distracted, checking emails on his phone when a movement outside the window caught his attention. In the middle of the intersection, a woman in a wheelchair was offering flowers to drivers. With her were two boys, pushing the wheelchair with evident effort, balancing the small bouquets in their hands. At first, Jonathan looked at them without much thought. Street vendors were common in New York, especially in busy areas like that one. But something made him stare. He frowned. The boys had slightly wavy brown hair, cut simply, but what really caught his attention was their faces, identical to his own when he was a child, even down to the eyes. Green, intense, just like his. He blinked, intrigued. "Sir, would you like a bouquet?" A young voice pulled him out of his thoughts. One of the boys, the taller one, approached his window. Jonathan hesitated. The child couldn't have been more than 6 years old, looking at him with a mix of hope and shyness. The other boy stayed by the wheelchair, watching, as if knowing he shouldn't leave the woman alone. Jonathan rolled down the window a bit. "How much?" he asked, in a colder tone than he intended. $5, sir. "It's to help our mom," the boy replied, extending the flowers. Jonathan took out a $20 bill, handed it to the boy, and said, "Keep the change." The boy smiled, but before he could thank him, horns blared behind Jonathan's car. The light had just turned green, and the impatient drivers were already urging him on. Jonathan accelerated, leaving the woman and the boys behind. When he arrived at his luxurious office in the heart of Manhattan, Jonathan couldn't concentrate. The boy's words echoed in his mind. "It's to help our mom." Something about that encounter deeply unsettled him. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to focus on the meeting about to begin. "Blake, what do you think about the projections for the next quarter?" one of the directors asked. Jonathan looked up, confused, not even remembering what was being discussed. It was unusual for him, a man known for his sharp attention and quick decision-making abilities. He muttered something generic, enough to keep the conversation going, but he knew his mind was elsewhere. Later, in his apartment, Jonathan tried to ignore the unease that consumed him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, sitting in front of the large glass window overlooking the New York City skyline. The city shone, busy and chaotic as always, but Jonathan felt an increasing emptiness. He looked at the table beside the sofa and noticed he had brought the bouquet. Even without taking it, someone at the intersection had thrown it through his open window as he left. He picked up the flowers, now a bit crushed, and examined them. The sweet scent of lavender and roses mingled with something inexplicably melancholic. "Who were they?" he murmured to himself. Jonathan got up and walked to the mirror in the hallway. He looked into his own green eyes and, for a moment, thought of the boys. The resemblance couldn't be ignored. They reminded him of himself as a child, the same determined expression, despite the circumstances. That night, he couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, as if an invisible force were calling him back to that intersection. The questions piled up in his mind. Who was that woman? And the boys? Why did he feel so strange, as if they were somehow connected to him? The next day, during a meeting with his assistant, Jonathan did something he rarely did. He lost his patience. "Samantha, we need a bit more dynamism here," he exclaimed, slamming his palm on the glass table. "Where are the market analyses I asked for yesterday?" Samantha, who had always admired him for his calm demeanor, looked visibly surprised. "Mr. Blake, with all due respect, you seem distracted. Is everything okay?" Jonathan rubbed his face with his hands. "Yes, I'm fine. Just do what I asked." But he knew he wasn't fine, and he knew exactly why. By late afternoon, Jonathan took his car and drove back to the intersection. He needed to see that woman and the boys again, as if it would provide some answer to what he was feeling. When he got there, the traffic was just as chaotic, but they were no longer there. He slowed down, looking around, trying to find any trace of them. Nothing. Feeling frustrated, he parked his car at a nearby cafe. He sat at a table near the window, with a clear view of the street. He stayed there for almost an hour, as if waiting for them to suddenly reappear. He finished his coffee but remained still, lost in his thoughts. "Are you okay, sir?" the waiter asked, noticing his distant expression. Jonathan nodded, but the words that came out of his mouth surprised even him. "I'm looking for someone." He couldn't explain why, but that encounter at the intersection had stirred something inside him that he couldn't ignore. It was as if the image of the boys, so much like him, had opened a door to memories he had long buried. When he got home, Jonathan felt emptier than ever. He walked out to the balcony, looking at the city lights, while a persistent thought echoed in his mind: "They might be my children." And for the first time, Jonathan Blake, a man who always had absolute control over his life, felt fear. The morning after the encounter at the intersection, Jonathan Blake already knew he wouldn't be able to follow his routine as usual. The faces of the boys and the image of the woman in her wheelchair, her eyes full of determination and sadness, haunted him every moment. He couldn't focus on work, and the frustration grew in his chest. Jonathan wasn't a man easily swayed by emotions, but something about that family seemed to poke at parts of him that had long been dormant. "Mr. Blake, you have a call from the board in London." The voice of his assistant, Samantha, brought him back to reality. Jonathan looked up, but couldn't feign interest. "Tell them I'll call back later, Samantha. And I need someone from security in my office now." "Of course, sir." Samantha didn't question it, though it was rare for him to ignore important meetings. Minutes later, a private investigator recommended by his security team entered the office. He was a discreet man, in a dark suit, with a demeanor that exuded efficiency. "Mr. Blake, I'm Andrew Cole. I heard you need information on someone." Jonathan gestured for him to sit, getting straight to the point. "Yesterday, at the intersection of 5th Avenue and 45th, I saw a woman in a wheelchair selling flowers. She was with two small boys. I want you to find out everything about them." Andrew raised an eyebrow slightly, but maintained professionalism. "Any additional information?" Jonathan hesitated, then spoke. "The boys. They're about 6 years old, and they look like me. I want to know who they are, where they live, everything." "Understood. It might take a few days. I'll need access to your exact description of the scene." Jonathan nodded, providing all the details he could remember. When Andrew left, Jonathan felt a weight. There was something inside him that knew what he was looking for, but his mind refused to accept it. 2 days later, Andrew returned with the first pieces of information. Jonathan received him in his office, anxious and tense. "Did you find anything?" he asked, barely waiting for Andrew to sit. The investigator handed him an envelope with a dossier. The woman's name is Hannah Sullivan. She's 36, was an economist in the past, but her life took a difficult turn a few years ago. She sells flowers at Manhattan intersections to support her two sons, Liam and Noah Sullivan, both 6 years old. Jonathan flipped through the pages as Andrew spoke. The photograph of Hannah in the dossier made him pause. Although older, marked by time and hardships, he immediately recognized the features. Hannah Sullivan, he murmured, the name bringing back vague memories of a distant past. Andrew continued, she was in a car accident 5 years ago, which left her paralyzed. There are no clear records about the children's father. Medical history indicates she was hospitalized for months after the accident and has been living in precarious financial conditions ever since. Jonathan put the papers down on the table. His mind was spinning at a dizzying speed. I need you to find out more. I want to know where she lives, who else is involved. Andrew nodded. We've already located her address. She lives in a small apartment in a modest neighborhood in the Bronx. If you want, I can try to establish contact with her. Jonathan shook his head, standing up and walking to the window. No, I'll go see her myself. Andrew paused before responding. Mr. Blake, I must warn you. This situation may be more delicate than it seems. I don't need you to tell me that, Jonathan replied firmly. But inside, doubt and anxiety were beginning to grow. That night, Jonathan sat in his living room with a glass of whiskey. He looked at the photos in the dossier, especially Hannah's. There was something in her green eyes that cut through him like a blade. He remembered London, many years ago, an exchange program during his last year of college. A rainy night. Hannah, he whispered, as flashes of that brief affair flooded his mind. She was brilliant, ambitious, full of opinions. He remembered how their conversations went on for hours. Jonathan never had patience for most people, but there was something about Hannah that disarmed him. He also remembered how it ended. No promises, no emotional goodbyes. Jonathan left to pursue his career, and the affair was buried in the past like so many others. But what if? He placed the glass of whiskey on the table abruptly. The idea was absurd, but it couldn't be ignored. Liam and Noah. Could they be his sons? Jonathan ran his hands over his face. If it was true, why had Hannah never looked for him? Or had she tried? A mix of disbelief and a growing sense of responsibility began to overwhelm him. I need to know. I need to be sure. The clock on the wall read 2 in the morning when Jonathan finally went to bed. But he knew sleep would be impossible. The next day, before leaving to meet her, Jonathan took one last look at the dossier. He repeated the information like a mantra. Economist, 2 sons, accident, a past full of pain and struggle. He wondered what he would find when he faced her, when he looked closely at the boys. More than ever, he feared the answers as much as he wanted them. Hannah Sullivan, he murmured as he grabbed his car keys. The intersection where their lives crossed again was just the beginning of something much bigger than he was prepared to face. Jonathan drove toward the Bronx, his heart heavy. Could Liam and Noah really be his sons? And if they were, how could he deal with a reality that threatened to unravel everything he believed about himself? The truth awaited him, and he knew that once he found it, there would be no turning back. Jonathan parked his luxurious car on a narrow street in the Bronx, a stark contrast to the grandeur of Manhattan. The address provided by the investigator led him to a worn brick building, with small windows and some faded curtains. He stayed in the car for a few minutes, taking deep breaths. He wasn't sure how to start the conversation, but he knew he needed answers. As he walked toward the building's entrance, a feeling of discomfort overwhelmed him. The smell of fried food coming from a nearby restaurant mixed with the sound of children playing and cars honking in the distance. Jonathan looked at the crumpled paper with the apartment number and decided not to overthink it. The moment he rang the doorbell, his breathing grew heavy. A few seconds passed before the door opened, revealing one of the boys. He recognized him immediately. It was the taller one, the one who had offered him flowers at the intersection. "Hi," the boy said, frowning. Jonathan hesitated, his voice failing for a moment. "Is your mom here?" The boy looked inside and shouted, "Mom, there's a man here." He heard her voice in the background, still not seeing her. "Liam, how many times have I told you not to open the door to strangers?" A moment later, she appeared. Hannah. Although the years had left evident marks, Jonathan recognized her. Her brown hair was tied in a messy bun, and dark circles framed the green eyes he remembered so well. She was in her wheelchair, wearing a simple blouse and faded jeans. When she saw him, her expression changed from fatigue to surprise and then to suspicion. "Jonathan?" she asked, her voice filled with incredulity. "Hannah." He swallowed, the tension between them almost palpable. She partially closed the door, leaving only a crack open. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he replied, trying to stay calm. "Can I come in?" "I don't think that's a good idea." Her voice was firm, but he noticed the nervousness in her gaze. Jonathan sighed. "Please, Hannah, I didn't come to cause trouble. I need to understand some things." She remained silent for a moment, clearly reluctant. Then she looked at Liam, who was watching quietly, and nodded for him to go inside. "Go play with your brother in the room." Liam obeyed, and Hannah opened the door just enough to let him in. The apartment was small and simple, but clean and organized. There were toys scattered on the floor and children's drawings pinned to the fridge. Jonathan felt a knot in his stomach as he realized those drawings were probably from the boys. "Speak quickly." Her voice cut through his thoughts. He turned to face her, trying to gather the right words. "I saw you at the intersection. You and the boys." Hannah raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "And they?" Jonathan took a deep breath. "They're my children, aren't they?" Hannah went rigid. For a moment, she seemed to struggle with what to say. "Why does it matter now?" she replied, bitterness evident in her voice. "Because I didn't know." He took a step forward, lowering his tone. "I had no idea." "You didn't know?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Jonathan, I tried to contact you. I sent emails, called. You never responded." "I never received anything," he said quickly, sincerity written all over his face. "I swear, Hannah, I never knew you were pregnant." She stared at him, searching for something in his face, perhaps a lie or hesitation, but found nothing. "You're telling me you never got my messages?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger and frustration. "Nothing." Jonathan shook his head, almost desperate. "I don't know what happened, but I didn't get them." "If I had known," Hannah interrupted, her voice filled with resentment. "If you had known what? Would you have left your perfect life to help? Would you have come here, to the Bronx, to take responsibility?" He remained silent, unable to answer immediately. "Look, Jonathan, it doesn't matter anymore. I raised the boys on my own. I was alone when my family rejected me, alone when I lost my job, alone after the accident that left me like this." She pointed at the wheelchair. Jonathan felt as if a weight had fallen on him. "I didn't know, Hannah, and I'm sorry." "You're sorry?" She shook her head, a tear rolling down her cheek. "You weren't there. You don't know what it was like to go through all of this. And now, after all these years, you show up and want what? A thank you for being here? That's not it." He took a step towards her, but stopped when he saw her expression. "I just want to understand. I want to know about the boys." "Liam and Noah don't need you," Hannah said, her voice firm once again. "They have me, and that's enough." Jonathan ran his hand over his face, frustrated. "Do you think it's easy for me? I just found out about them now. And yes, I want to be part of their lives. I want to make right what went wrong." Hannah watched him for a long moment, the silence between them filled only by the distant sound of the boys playing in the room. "They don't know who you are," she finally said, "and I'm not going to let you come in and destabilize what took years for me to build." Jonathan felt the impact of her words, but didn't back down. "I'm not giving up, Hannah. I want to do what's right, for you and for them." She looked away, appearing tired. "Just leave, Jonathan." He opened his mouth to respond, but then closed it. He knew that conversation wasn't going anywhere at that moment. "I'll find out what happened, Hannah. And when I have answers, I'll be back." Hannah didn't reply, just watched as he headed for the door. When Jonathan left, the cold air outside hit him, but it wasn't enough to extinguish the heat of the conversation that still burned in his mind. He knew he couldn't just walk away from this story. Jonathan couldn't forget the last conversation with Hannah. Her words echoed in his mind, accusing him of an abandonment he hadn't even known had occurred. Anger and frustration gnawed at him, but above all, he felt an immense weight of responsibility. He needed to understand what had happened. The next morning, he rummaged through old files on his laptop, reviewing emails from the time Hannah said she tried to contact him. There were trivial messages, meeting records, contracts, but nothing related to Hannah. It was as if she had never tried to reach him. Frustrated and determined, Jonathan picked up the phone and called Andrew Cole, the private investigator. "Andrew, I need you to find a data recovery specialist. I want them to check my email history, especially deleted messages from about 7 years ago." Andrew hesitated before replying. "Mr. Blake, this could take a few days. Old messages, especially deleted ones, can be difficult to recover. I don't care how long it takes." "Do it," Jonathan replied firmly. While awaiting the results, Jonathan started investigating other aspects of Hannah's life. He asked Andrew to deepen his research. A few days later, Andrew returned with concerning information. "Mr. Blake, I found something relevant," Andrew said, spreading documents over Jonathan's office desk. He began recounting the events that had turned Hannah's life into a nightmare. The car accident that left her paralyzed, the difficulty in finding work due to her condition, and most concerning, a lawyer she had hired to seek financial support. "She tried to sue me?" Jonathan asked, feeling his stomach turn. "Not exactly." Andrew flipped through the papers. "From what I discovered, she hired a lawyer to try to locate you and secure some kind of assistance for the children. But the lawyer stole the little money she had and abandoned the case." Jonathan ran his hands over his face, struggling to absorb the impact of the information. "So while I was expanding my business, living comfortably, she was fighting all of this alone." Andrew remained silent, knowing there was nothing to say to soften the situation. A few days later, the data recovery specialist finally got in touch. Jonathan received him in his office, anxious. "Mr. Blake, we managed to recover some deleted messages." He handed Jonathan a flash drive. Jonathan plugged the device into his laptop and opened the files. Hannah's messages were there. One after another, she spoke about the pregnancy, about the boys, and begged for a response. Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest as he read her words. But then, something caught his attention. One of the messages had a response sent from his email, but one he didn't recognize. "I don't want anything to do with you or those twin kids, not even one, let alone two. Handle it yourself." The room seemed to spin around him. He had never written those words. "Is this a forgery?" Jonathan asked, his voice tense. The specialist shook his head. "Not exactly. It looks like someone used your email, maybe with direct access to your account. The response was sent from a device connected to your Wi-Fi at the time." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, trying to process it. Who could have done this? That's when the memory of Vivian, his girlfriend at the time, hit him like lightning. She had access to the apartment, the Wi-Fi, and more importantly, knew his email password. Without wasting time, Jonathan picked up the phone and called Vivian. Finding her was easier than he expected. Vivian still lived in New York, now married to a real estate businessman. When he arrived at her house, Vivian seemed surprised to see him, but kept her usual composure. "Jonathan, it's been so long," she began with a smile that he didn't return. "I'm not here to socialize, Vivian." His voice was cold. "I want answers." She crossed her arms, frowning. "What are you talking about?" "Hannah Sullivan. You knew she was pregnant with my child, and you intercepted her emails. I want to know why." Vivian turned pale. "Jonathan, that was years ago. Why does it matter now?" "Because while you were playing with people's lives, Hannah had to raise 2 children on her own, facing unimaginable difficulties. Answer me, Vivian. Was it you who sent that message?" She avoided his gaze but finally gave in. "Yes, it was me. I saw the emails and deleted them all. I couldn't let her disrupt our relationship." Jonathan stared at her, incredulous. "Relationship? Vivian, you destroyed lives. You pretended to be me and told her to disappear. I was afraid of losing you," she retorted, her voice rising. "You know how hard I worked to be by your side, to be part of your world. I couldn't let an ex-girlfriend and a baby ruin everything." Jonathan shook his head, feeling a rage he could barely contain. "You had no right." Vivian shrugged, trying to justify her actions. "And what are you going to do now, Jonathan? You can't change the past." He stepped closer, looking directly into her eyes. "But I can fix the future." Jonathan left her house without looking back, feeling a mixture of indignation and determination. He knew there was still more to uncover, and that each new revelation would take him deeper into the devastating impact of the lies and betrayals that had torn his family apart. He needed to set things right. Jonathan parked his car in front of the same building in the Bronx. This time, he carried something he hoped would change the dynamics of the conversation: the truth. He knew that what he had discovered about the emails and Vivian's manipulation was just the beginning, but he believed Hannah needed to hear it. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Liam answered again, looking at him with the same mixture of curiosity and distrust as the last time. "Hi, buddy. Is your mom home?" Jonathan asked, trying to sound gentle. Liam didn't answer, just called for Hannah. When she appeared at the door, her expression immediately hardened. "What are you doing here again?" she asked, not even trying to hide her discomfort. "We need to talk. I found out something important about what happened." Hannah crossed her arms, her gaze full of skepticism. "I already said everything I had to say, Jonathan. I don't know why you keep insisting. Please, just listen to me." He gestured towards the hallway. "If you don't want the boys to hear, we can talk outside." Hannah hesitated, looking at Liam, who was still peeking at the conversation. "Go to your room with your brother," she ordered. After the children's footsteps disappeared down the hallway, Hannah wheeled herself outside and closed the door behind her. Just say what you have to say. Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling the tension in the air. I never received the emails you sent. Never. Hannah scoffed, shaking her head. That doesn't make sense. I sent them. I have copies. You ignored every single one. I know it seems that way, Jonathan interrupted, trying to keep calm. But I found out that Vivian, my girlfriend at the time, intercepted the emails. She deleted them and even sent a fake response pretending to be me. Hannah narrowed her eyes, her stance still defensive. And you expect me to believe that? Yes, because it's the truth. Jonathan responded, almost pleading. I hired specialists to recover the deleted emails. They confirmed everything. Vivian tried to manipulate me, and you were caught in the middle of it. For a moment, Hannah was silent, processing what she had just heard. And even if that's true, Jonathan, what difference does it make? I spent 6 years raising our children alone. No one came to help when I needed it. You were living your life while mine fell apart. I know, Jonathan admitted, his voice low. I can't change the past, but I want to be part of the present and the future, for you and the boys. Hannah laughed, but there was no humor in her tone. The boys don't even know who you are. To them, you're just a stranger who suddenly showed up. That can change, Jonathan insisted. But I need your permission to try. Hannah looked at him, her green eyes fixed on his. I won't stop you, Jonathan. But know that the boys don't trust anyone but me. If you really want to be part of their lives, you'll need more than words. The next day, Jonathan went to a park near Hannah's building, where she had mentioned she took the boys to play. He arrived early, bought helium balloons and a kite kit. When he saw them arriving, Hannah in her wheelchair and the 2 boys running ahead, Jonathan felt a pang of nervousness. What are you doing here? Hannah asked as soon as she saw him. I want to spend some time with them. Just a few hours. Hannah sighed but reluctantly nodded. Liam and Noah looked at him suspiciously as he approached. Hi, boys. My name is Jonathan. He knelt to their level. I know this might be strange, but I wanted to ask if you like flying kites. The 2 boys exchanged glances, but Liam responded first. We've never flown one. Jonathan smiled. Then today's the day. He handed them the kite kit, trying to hide his anxiety. Noah took the box, still cautious, while Liam continued to watch him. Why do you want to play with us? Liam asked bluntly. Jonathan hesitated, feeling the weight of the question. Because I want to get to know you better. Liam didn't reply, but he didn't reject the invitation either. Over the next hour, Jonathan tried to connect with the boys. He helped them assemble the kite, patiently explaining each step. When they finally got it to fly, Noah let out a shy laugh, something Jonathan considered a small victory. Hannah watched from a distance, her expression closed. Jonathan knew she was analyzing every move, ready to step in if he failed. While pulling the kite string alongside Liam, Jonathan decided to try a more direct conversation. Liam, what do you like to do the most? The boy shrugged. Play soccer. Soccer, huh? Maybe I could watch one of your games sometime. Liam looked at him, surprised. You'd do that? Sure. Jonathan smiled. I'm not very good, but we could practice together if you want. Liam didn't respond, but there was less coldness in his expression. Later, as the sun began to set, Hannah called the boys home. Jonathan walked them to the building gate, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I think it was a good start, he said to Hannah, as the boys ran to the apartment. Hannah crossed her arms. Maybe. But don't confuse tolerance with acceptance, Jonathan. They still don't trust you. I know, he replied. But I'll keep trying. Hannah sighed but didn't push him away. As Jonathan walked back to his car, he knew there was a long road ahead. Earning the boy's affection and Hannah's trust wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to do whatever it took. Jonathan was in his office, bent over documents and notes related to Hannah's life. Each discovery seemed to worsen his sense of guilt and helplessness. But something about the corrupt lawyer she had hired didn't seem right. It was a pattern. Every time Hannah tried to seek help or reach out to him, something or someone interfered. Jonathan decided he needed to dig deeper. He called Andrew, the private investigator, to discuss what he had in mind. Andrew, I want you to investigate the lawyer Hannah hired years ago. I need to know exactly what he did, and if there's anything else she didn't mention. Andrew made a note in his notebook. I'll start looking into the records, but from what we already know, he misappropriated her fees and didn't deliver on what was promised. Jonathan shook his head, frustrated. It's not just that. There's something bigger. She tried to contact me multiple times and was sabotaged. I don't think it was just the lawyer. You think he was involved in something more? Andrew raised an eyebrow. That's exactly what I want to find out. Days later, Andrew returned with disturbing information. Mr. Blake, the lawyer, was fired from the firm he worked at back then for misconduct. He faced accusations of embezzlement, but there was another interesting detail. Jonathan frowned. What is it? Hannah, desperate for help and still unaware that the lawyer was stealing from her, reached out for further assistance. I found anonymous emails sent to Hannah at the time. They were threatening, demanding that she stop trying to contact you. Jonathan felt his blood boil. Threats? What kind? Andrew handed him copies of the recovered emails. Jonathan read each word with growing indignation. If you keep trying to get close to Jonathan, you'll regret it. He wants nothing to do with you or those children. Take care of your life and stay away. Another email said, if you insist, you'll find out what it means to lose everything. This is not a request. It's an order. Jonathan clenched his fists, the paper trembling in his hands. She received this while she was alone, raising our children? Yes. And it seems she continued receiving threats even after the accident. Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to control his anger. I need to talk to her. Now. He went to Hannah's apartment that same afternoon. When she opened the door, she noticed something different in his expression. What now, Jonathan? She asked, suspicious. I discovered something you need to know. He looked inside the apartment. Can we talk? Hannah hesitated but let him in. The boys were in the room, and Jonathan waited until she closed the door to start. When you tried to find me years ago, did you receive threats? Hannah frowned, surprised by the question. Why are you asking that? Jonathan took the papers from the folder and handed them to her. Because I found these messages. Hannah picked up the papers, and as she read the content, her expression hardened. Yes, I received these. Several times. Her voice trembled. But how do you know about them now? My investigation found these emails. It seems someone didn't want you getting close to me. Hannah threw the papers onto the table with a bitter sigh. This only confirms what I already knew. I was completely alone. I didn't have you, I didn't have my family, and I still had people threatening me. Jonathan felt the weight of the pain in her words. Why didn't you tell me this before? For what? She countered, crossing her arms. What would it change? It changes everything, Hannah. He leaned forward, the determination evident in his eyes. Because now I know someone deliberately tried to destroy any chance of us being together as a family." Hannah stared at him, her voice low and full of hurt. "You don't understand, Jonathan. Those messages weren't just words. They were a constant reminder that, no matter how hard I tried, I would never have you by my side." Jonathan rubbed his face, fighting against the growing anger toward those who had done this. "I swear I'll find out who's behind this, and I'll make sure they pay for everything they've done." Hannah laughed bitterly. "You think you can fix everything with your wealth and power? Some things can't be fixed, Jonathan." "Maybe not," he admitted, his voice softer. "But I'm not going to stand by while someone broke our lives like this." Hannah watched him for a long moment, her expression oscillating between anger and exhaustion. "Do whatever you want, Jonathan. But that won't change what the boys feel. They already have a father. It's me." Jonathan stood up, still staring at her. "And I respect that, Hannah. But I'm going to prove to you, and to them, that I can be more than the man you hate to remember." He left, leaving Hannah alone in the room. When she looked at the papers again, tears rolled down her cheeks silently. She didn't know if Jonathan's words were empty promises, or if he truly intended to follow through. That night, Jonathan decided he would do everything he could to bring justice to the woman who had suffered so much and to the children he barely knew. Jonathan couldn't shake the weight of the threats Hannah had received. The messages were a constant reminder that, even in the worst phase of her life, she was attacked and intimidated. He knew that promising justice wasn't enough. He needed to act. He hired a digital security specialist, a young man named Ryan, known for his ability to trace communication sources that seemed impossible to uncover. "Mr. Blake, these messages were sent from anonymous accounts, probably protected by layers of privacy. It won't be easy, but it is possible." "I don't want excuses, Ryan," Jonathan replied. "I want results. Find out who did this." While Ryan began his work, Jonathan decided to investigate another lead. He revisited Vivian. Despite everything he had already discovered about her manipulation, he couldn't ignore the possibility that she was even more involved. Vivian agreed to meet him at a luxury cafe on the Upper East Side. She seemed surprised to see him again, but as always, her demeanor was impeccable, as if time and revelations hadn't affected her. "Jonathan, what a surprise," she said with an artificial smile. He didn't return the smile. "Vivian, I'll get straight to the point. I discovered the threatening emails sent to Hannah. I want to know if you had anything to do with it." Vivian's smile disappeared. "Threats? What kind of threats?" Jonathan kept his eyes on her, searching for any sign of a lie. "Messages intimidating Hannah, telling her never to get close to me." "Jonathan, you know I wouldn't do something like that. I did what I did because, well, I was immature and selfish. But this, no." "Then tell me, who else knew about Hannah and the boys?" He leaned forward, his voice colder. Vivian hesitated, looking at the table. "After I found out about the pregnancy, I talked to someone about it." "Who?" Jonathan asked, his tone urgent. "Edward." Jonathan froze. "Edward? My brother?" "Yes," Vivian admitted, now visibly uncomfortable. "I was desperate, and I thought he could help me. I told him about Hannah and the children." Jonathan took a deep breath, the anger beginning to build. "And what did he do, Vivian?" "I don't know. He told me not to worry, that he would take care of everything. I didn't ask anything more after that." Jonathan stood up abruptly, throwing money onto the table to cover the coffees they hadn't drunk. "You've done enough, Vivian," she called out to him before he left. "Jonathan, I didn't know he would do something like this." He ignored her, leaving the cafe with firm steps. When he got home, he received a call from Ryan. "Mr. Blake, I managed to trace the messages. They were sent from devices belonging to someone named Edward Blake." Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to contain his rage. "Thank you, Ryan. Keep monitoring any other activity." Jonathan went to his brother's mansion that same night. Edward received him in the living room, looking confused by the unexpected visit. "Jonathan, this is rare. What brings you here at this hour?" Jonathan didn't waste time. "Why did you do it, Edward?" Edward's smile disappeared. "What are you talking about? You sent the threats to Hannah. You sabotaged any chance she had of getting close to me or the boys." Edward let out a short but nervous laugh. "That's absurd." Jonathan showed Edward the messages Ryan had sent him after the call. "These are the digital traces of the messages. They lead directly to you." Edward went pale but still tried to deny it. "Jonathan, I would never do something like that. Maybe someone used my devices. Vivian already confessed that she talked to you about the pregnancy. And now I have evidence pointing to you." Jonathan took a step forward, his voice low but threatening. "Confess." Edward backed up, raising his hands. All right, I did it." Jonathan remained silent, his rage almost palpable. "Why?" Edward looked at him, now a mix of panic and shame. "I was scared, Jonathan. Scared of losing everything." "Losing what?" Jonathan shouted. "The fortune." Edward exploded, his voice desperate. "You have no one else but me. If those boys were recognized as your children, I wouldn't be the sole heir anymore. Everything I built, everything I dreamed of, would disappear." Jonathan stared at his brother, feeling a mix of disbelief and disgust. "You destroyed lives, Edward. You made Hannah suffer, made my children grow up without a father, all because of greed?" "It wasn't just greed," Edward shouted, his voice breaking. "It was fear. You were always the favorite. You always had everything. I just wanted to make sure I wouldn't be discarded." Jonathan shook his head, unable to believe what he was hearing. "You were never discarded, Edward. You discarded yourself by doing this." Edward tried to justify himself, but Jonathan raised his hand, stopping him. "I'm cutting you out of my life, and I'll make sure you pay for everything you've done." He left his brother's house, feeling the weight of betrayal crushing his shoulders. The person he trusted more than anyone else had caused so much suffering. Jonathan knew that confronting Edward was just the beginning. The journey to right the wrongs of the past was far from over. Jonathan knew he had crossed a point of no return. The betrayals that had torn his life from Hannah and the boys were uncovered, but the damage ran deep. Now, he needed to prove that his commitment went beyond words or promises.